Everything I've ever done, my mother told 200 guests, has been an embarrassment to this family. Her voice didn't rise. It never had to. The banquet hall at the Royal Canadian Legion in Barrie went quiet enough that I could hear the ice settling in someone's glass 3 tables over. Every face turned toward me, already primed with the version of me my mother had been writing for 15 years. She rested her hand on the shoulder of the man beside her, a Royal Canadian Air Force flight lieutenant with a chest full of ribbons she'd met for the first time that evening, and she smiled like a woman unveiling a monument. This, she told the room, is the kind of officer I always pictured for this family. Not someone who plays soldier behind a desk because she couldn't hack a real posting. My uncle chuckled into his rye. My sister's husband smirked at his plate. I stood there in my service uniform, captain's pips squared on my shoulders, absorbing the kind of public erasure only a mother can deliver and make look like affection for someone else. The flight lieutenant wasn't laughing. His eyes had gone to my shoulder boards, then to the small gray wings pinned above my left breast pocket, the ones almost nobody outside the intelligence trade recognizes on sight. His whole posture changed, like a man's spine remembering it used to stand at attention for something. His jaw came open and his voice, when it finally worked, carried clean across that silent hall. "You're FERRET," he said. "You're the one they call FERRET." But before I tell you why that one word from a decorated airman brought my mother's entire performance crashing down in under 3 minutes, and who finally had to answer for 30 years of pretending not to notice, hit like, subscribe, and stick around, because what happened in that hall next, not even my mother saw coming. The Barrie Legion holds its Forces Family Recognition Dinner every June, and that year it fell on a humid Friday that smelled like cut grass and someone's cheap cologne. My mother, Roberta, stood at the lectern in a navy blazer she'd had tailored for the occasion, hair freshly done, the posture of a woman accepting an award she hadn't earned. She introduced the flight lieutenant, young, sharp-jawed, 3 tours behind him, like she'd personally raised him from a cadet. Then she turned to me. Her eyes went flat, the particular flatness she saved for family functions, and she delivered the line I'd heard variations of since I was 9 years old. I knew it was rehearsed because I'd heard the rough draft of it at my cousin's wedding 2 years prior, and a slightly sharper edit of it at Easter the year after that. This was simply the final cut, polished for the biggest audience she'd ever assembled. This wasn't a flash of temper. This was a campaign with a venue, a guest of honor, and a script she'd been workshopping with my sister, Cassandra, over the phone for weeks. I stood very still. My thumb found the record button on my phone inside my blazer pocket, the same reflex I use in every debrief where I need a clean transcript later. Whatever she said next, I'd have it on file. Then I did the thing I'm trained to do in any room. I read it. My Uncle Doug had his 3rd rye in hand, ice clinking, the satisfied look of a man who's never once paid for the show he enjoys. This was the same uncle who'd spent a decade telling the Legion crowd in Aurelia exactly what he thought my career amounted to, despite knowing better, because the truth was inconvenient for his own standing at the bar. My sister Cassandra had her phone up, filming, not for memory, for ammunition, the kind of footage that ends up captioned with something cruel in the family group chat by morning. And at the head table sat her husband, Brent, the man my mother had once hoped would make a soldier, who'd been asked to leave officer training in Kingston for reasons the family still doesn't say out loud, slouched in his chair with a rye and ginger he wasn't supposed to have, because Roberta had quietly arranged for the bar to look the other way for family. A man who'd washed out of every uniform he ever tried on sat in the seat of honor because he had the right last name and the right anatomy attached to it, while the woman wearing captain's rank stood on the open floor taking insults through a borrowed microphone. The seating chart alone told you everything. I didn't need her to say another word. She continued anyway, voice gaining that particular certainty she gets when she knows the room is hers, not someone who plays soldier behind a desk. The crowd murmured exactly where she'd trained it to murmur over the years. Doug smirked on cue. Cassandra leaned toward her husband and whispered something. Somebody laughed. I breathed in for 4 counts, held for 7, out for 8, heart rate steady, eyes still moving. And that's when I caught it. The shift in the flight lieutenant's face. Something behind his eyes flipping from polite guest to fully alert, the way a system switches the instant it recognizes a threat, or in this case, recognizes me. He was looking at my wings. At the small gray pin most people in that hall had never noticed on a uniform before. His expression didn't shift gradually. It broke open all at once. "You're FERRET," he said again, louder this time, the word landing in that silent hall like a dropped plate. An old man near the front, Murray, 91 years old, 2 tours in Korea behind him, a cane worn smooth from decades of leaning on it, set down his fork hard enough that the clink of metal on china carried to every corner of the room. My mother's smile died somewhere between her eyes and her mouth. I watched the calculation happen behind her face, the same calculation I'd seen my whole childhood whenever something threatened to slip outside her control. I looked down at my own hands. calluses along the base of every finger, built from rope, from rifle grips, from years of equipment I won't list here. A soldier's hands. But my body remembered older things first. It remembered being 9 years old, kneeling on cold kitchen tile in our house outside Aurelia, scrubbing a muddy footprint with an old toothbrush because I'd tracked in mud from the backyard after a thunderstorm. My mother didn't yell. Yelling was for people who'd lost control, and she never lost control. She set the toothbrush on the floor in front of me, crossed her arms, and told me to scrub it until she could see her reflection in the tile. I didn't cry, because crying would have given her something she wanted. I scrubbed until my knuckles ached, and that was the year I understood that obedience was the only currency she'd accept from me, and I had nothing else to offer at 9 years old. The next lesson came a few months later, after I left a hairline scratch on the dining table. Solid maple, the one piece of furniture that had come down from my grandfather. My mother took my wrist without a word and walked me to the hallway, pressed my forehead against the wall, and told me to stand there until she said I was done. 4 hours. I listened to cutlery clinking through a dinner I wasn't allowed to join, the television murmuring in the next room, my father's quiet cough behind a closed door, and then nothing, because drawing attention to himself only ever redirected Roberta's attention onto whoever was nearby. I heard her on the phone, laughing about some trip she was planning, while her daughter stood 3 rooms away with her forehead against cold drywall. That night, with no audience and no need for a performance, she told me the truth plainly for the first time. "You were born a disappointment in this house," she said. "No matter how hard you try, you'll always be background noise next to the people who actually carry something forward." She pushed my head down until my forehead touched the cold tile floor of the front hall. "Don't fool yourself," she said, and walked away without waiting for me to answer, because she already knew I wouldn't dare. She had no idea that every time she told me what I couldn't be, something in my 10-year-old brain quietly clicked a lock open and added one more line to a list. A list of every single thing I was going to prove her wrong about, one by one, for as long as it took. That night, my father came in. Gerald, tall once, shrinking by the month, a tumor working through his lungs like rust through an old hull. He sat on the edge of my bed, put a hand on top of my head, and didn't speak for a long time. Then he pressed a folded scrap of paper into my palm, along with an old set of dog tags that had belonged to his own father, who'd served in Korea. On the paper, in his careful handwriting, was a line he'd half remembered from somewhere, something about how the measure of a person isn't what they're handed, it's what they refuse to put down. He looked me in the eye and told me gender had nothing to do with grit, that I'd be the finest officer this family ever produced, and that I shouldn't let her break me. I hid those tags in the lining of my running shoe and carried them for the next 20 years. Through officer training at Kingston, inside my kit on 3 different places, against my chest on the long nights in the operations center, when the radios stayed quiet and you didn't know yet whether they'd stay that way. I was 17 when I laid the application for the Royal Military College on the kitchen table. No speech, no build-up, just set it down the way you'd put down a glass of water. Because to me, it really was that simple. My mother came in, saw the letterhead, paused exactly 2 seconds, and then picked it up with perfectly steady hands and tore it into quarters, then eighths, until the paper drifted down onto the tile like confetti. "Don't you dare drag this family's name through that," she hissed. "The only thing you're suited for is answering phones and pouring coffee at someone else's office." She left certain the matter was closed. That night, my father went into the kitchen alone. I watched from the staircase in the dark as he lowered himself slowly to his knees on the cold floor, hands trembling so badly the first piece of paper slipped twice before he could hold it, and gathered every torn scrap one at a time, the way you'd collect something far more fragile than paper. He was gone before I woke the next morning, and came back that afternoon without explaining anything, just looked at me across the hallway in a way that said it's handled. 3 weeks later, an application package arrived from the recruiting office in Toronto. He'd taped every shred back together with shaking hands, photocopied the reassembled form at the public library, and driven himself there and back in a body being hollowed out by chemo. That was the last brave thing Gerald ever did for me. I got in. The day I carried my kit bag out of my bedroom for the last time, my mother stood at the front door with her arms crossed. No goodbye, no blessing. She watched me walk down the steps, then went inside and locked the deadbolt behind her. When I came back 20 minutes later for a textbook I'd forgotten, my clothes were sitting on the porch in 2 black garbage bags, the heavy-duty kind. I picked them up, carried them to the bus stop, and didn't look back. 6 months into training, the phone rang at 4 in the morning. My father had collapsed. The cancer had finally won enough ground to land him in the ICU. There was no leave for cadets mid-cycle, so I laced up my boots and went to morning formation, because that's what Gerald would have told me to do. During a field exercise our company commander still talks about, when the rest of my section dug in and held position under simulated fire, I broke off, sacrificed a secondary observation post, and funneled the opposing force into a kill zone we'd rigged with smoke and noise. The exercise ended in under 10 minutes. Our commander, a hard man named Colonel FERRET, slammed his hand on the map table and looked at me like he was seeing something for the first time. "Whitlock," he said, "that wasn't my name, but it's close enough to what I'll tell you. You think like the people who write the rules other officers just follow. You'll work under me." First time in my life an authority figure looked at me and said I was good enough, with no asterisk attached. It started after my third posting overseas. Nobody gave the order, there's no manual entry for it. Before any operator headed out on a night op, at least one of them would walk past my desk in the operations center and tap 2 knuckles on the wood, quiet, quick, never looking me in the eye, like making eye contact would mean admitting out loud what they were really asking. "Ma'am, who calls my mom if I don't come back?" That was the real question underneath it. Not will I survive? Who handles what comes after? I never answered with comfort, because comfort gets people killed in that line of work. I'd pull up their file, copy the emergency contact into a small green notebook I kept locked in my desk drawer, and slide the drawer shut while they watched. Nobody ever said anything else. That notebook got heavier with every rotation, page after page of phone numbers belonging to mothers and wives and fathers who had no idea if the person they loved would still be breathing in 12 hours. It was the heaviest object in that building, heavier than anything in the armory, because every line in it was a conversation I'd rehearsed 100 times in my head so that if the day ever came, I wouldn't stumble over the words. One night before a raid, the flight lieutenant, Devereaux, his actual name, though I'd come to know him only by rank for months before that, came to my desk with that particular shade of pale on his face I privately filed under about to lose someone for the first time. He gripped his weapon with both hands and asked if I saw anything bad coming that night. It wasn't a tactical question. It was a man looking for certainty I wasn't qualified to give, and we both knew it. I slid the marked map across the desk. "I don't do fortune-telling," I told him. "I see what can be measured. Avoid the warehouse on the eastern approach. Follow the contingency route exactly, you'll make it home." No comfort, no warmth, just coordinates and probability, and it was the only kind of reassurance that ever actually kept anyone alive. That night, exactly as the threat picture predicted, his unit got pinned against a compound wall 30 seconds from walking into a corridor we hadn't cleared. The reroute I patched through 10 minutes before contact was the only thing standing between 11 people and a row of folded flags. He was alive tonight, decorated, and standing in a Legion hall beside my mother, because a woman he'd never met face to face had drawn a line on a map from 200 kilometers away at 3 in the morning. Not because of Roberta. Not because of the proud military family story she performed for the church bulletin and the Legion newsletter. That fact sat entirely outside every version of me she'd ever told anyone. The letters I sent home all came back unopened. The month I made captain, I mailed a photo of myself in dress uniform with a short note, no apology, just a notice that I'd made rank. 3 weeks later, it came back, seal unbroken, not a single fingerprint on the flap. I sent it again, same result. I didn't send a third, not because I'd given up, but because in my line of work, when a channel is consistently refused, you stop transmitting on it. You go dark. My father died that November. Lung cancer, the same disease that had been rotting his chest since the year he knelt on a kitchen floor to tape my future back together. I was on a flight home within 6 hours of the call. At the funeral home, I stood beside the casket in full dress uniform, ribbons across my chest like a map of everywhere I'd been. My mother stood exactly 2 meters to my left, close enough to share the frame of a photo, far enough that no angle would catch us standing together. When Doug and Cassandra came in to pay respects, my mother hooked Doug's elbow and physically turned them both so their backs faced me. Not accidental, measured. 2 hours of visitation, and not one person was permitted to shake my hand or even look at me directly. Doug worked the room like a man running interference, redirecting anyone who drifted toward me back to my mother with a handshake and a quiet word. The same Doug who knew exactly what I'd done overseas and chose silence every single time, because acknowledging it would have cracked the story Roberta had spent a decade building. Cassandra anchored the second row with her phone in hand, whispering corrections to anyone whose gaze lingered on me too long. Everyone in that room understood the arithmetic. Acknowledging me meant losing my mother's favor, and in that town, her approval traded higher than basic decency. I stood beside my father's casket for 2 hours without moving, because standing was the only thing I could still do for the man who'd knelt on cold tile with cancer eating his lungs, and taped my future back together with shaking hands. The moment I watched my mother's back for the last time that day, accepting a bouquet from Cassandra, laughing softly like a woman hosting brunch, something in my chest closed. Not pain, closure. I was done, not done hoping, because I'd been done hoping for years, done pretending there was anything left worth waiting for. My mother couldn't change because she didn't want to, and wanting to change requires the one capacity she never had, the ability to be wrong. I came to the Legion dinner that night because my current commanding officer asked me to represent the unit. "Be there, Captain." "Full dress," he said. He didn't explain why. When I walked through those doors, my mother was already at the lectern, microphone in hand, wearing the expression of a woman about to deliver the performance of her public life. 200 people, veterans, relatives, friends of the family, every one of them conditioned by a decade of her version of events. The daughter who ran off to play soldier and abandoned her poor mother. I found a chair near the back, set my spine against the wall, and read the room the way you read any space before deciding where the exits are. She introduced Devereaux. I wasn't listening to the speech. I was reading the man, rank, 3 operational tours, real to the field, not a prop. The crowd applauded on cue. Doug nodded along. Brent clapped at the head table with the loose rhythm of a man whose blood alcohol was working against him. Then she turned to me, held one theatrical beat, and opened fire. "Everything I've ever done is an embarrassment to this family," she said again, voice crisp with the confidence of a woman who'd never once been challenged in that room. "Devereaux here is the kind of officer I always pictured for this family. Not someone who plays soldier behind a desk because she couldn't hack a real posting." The hall murmured along the exact frequency she'd trained into them. Doug's glass rose. Cassandra leaned in. Someone laughed. I stood inside it, breathing steady, pulse steady, eyes moving, and that's when Devereaux's face came apart. "You're FERRET," he said. He stepped back half a pace, jaw open, his voice carrying to every corner of that hall, the question landing the way only people who'd actually served could measure. Murray dropped his fork. The crack of metal on china rang out like a small gunshot. My mother's mouth froze mid-breath. The room went silent in that specific way that has mass, the kind of silence that presses against the walls. In the tactical intelligence world, before that posting, the call sign assigned to my work had been picked at random by a systems clerk with a sense of humor. Something about how a ferret goes places nobody else can fit. After one particular night, it stopped being a joke and started being a name people said with respect. Back at base, months before any of this, there'd been a convoy call sign Echo 3 rolling a supply route through a valley when the lead vehicle hit an IED. The explosion tore through the radio channel, then half a second of dead air, the worst silence in that line of work, because it means the operator's just been thrown clear of the hull. Then screaming. Echo 3 to Overlord, pinned down, taking casualties, requesting immediate support. The operations center erupted. Status boards lighting up red. My pulse stayed steady. Every quick reaction team was out of range, minimum 35 minutes by air. 35 minutes might as well have been a season. I took the radio without asking. Echo 3, this is Overlord. Abort the route. Fall back to the secondary grid. Do not question this. Move now. No comfort, because in the time it takes to reassure someone under fire, people die. I cut the primary channel. The enemy had been jamming it for 6 minutes, feeding it garbage, and switched to a backup frequency I'd built myself before the operation even started. One that existed nowhere in the official plan, because I've never once trusted a plan without a second one hiding behind it. 40 seconds to breach the air support coordination network. A violation that could have ended my career in peacetime, but was the only thing standing between 11 people and a casualty report. 2 aircraft on routine patrol banked hard and came in. The strike hit coordinates I'd plotted from thermal imaging inside 90 seconds of the first call. Then Devereaux's voice came through the static, ragged but alive. "Overlord, we're pulling back. Confirm 0 additional casualties." The next morning, my commanding officer dropped a file on my desk with no explanation needed. From that point forward, in that small, specific community of people who do that kind of work, FERRET meant something very particular. The person who dismantles the enemy's whole plan from somewhere nobody can see. The invisible structure holding the line over the people who carry the visible weapons. Back in the hall, my mother's face locked for half a beat, long enough for anyone trained to read it to catch the fracture underneath. She recovered with a laugh and a wave of her hand. "Oh, please," she said. "FERRET code names. That's just paperwork people dress up to sound important. Don't give her too much credit, Lieutenant. That one's been afraid of her own shadow since she was in diapers." She waited for the room to follow her, the way it always had. Doug's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. Nobody laughed. The silence in that room had changed texture, denser, aimed somewhere she'd never had to face before. For the first time in her life, the room wasn't reading off her script. Devereaux squared his shoulders, the polite guest expression burning off his face. He dropped his chin the exact few degrees a junior officer uses addressing someone senior, and his voice filled that hall wall to wall. "With respect, ma'am," he said, "Captain Whitfield doesn't push paper. She's the reason 11 of us are still breathing tonight." My mother's mouth fell open. This was the first time in her life she'd been publicly contradicted by someone she'd handpicked specifically to humiliate her own daughter. In her arithmetic, that was the deepest betrayal possible, Worse than anything I'd ever done, because I was blood and blood could always be written off as a defective product. He was supposed to be the proof of her thesis, and her proof had just reversed its testimony in front of everyone she needed to impress. He turned to face the room without asking anyone's permission, delivering it the way you'd give a field report: flat, factual, impossible to argue with. During a night operation, our unit was ambushed and came within minutes of total loss, no clear way out. It was Captain Whitfield, call sign FERRET, who built the early warning that caught the trap, broke the enemy's communications in real time, and personally called in the support that pulled us out. She doesn't carry a rifle to do that work. Her mind is worth more than an entire strike package. Every person in my unit is alive tonight because of the woman your mother just called a desk soldier. Doug's rye glass slipped from his fingers and rolled across the white tablecloth, leaving a thin trail. His mouth hung open, the same mouth that had spent 10 years quietly endorsing my mother's version of me at every Legion gathering in the county. For the first time, the cost of that endorsement was being tallied in front of everyone, and the math wasn't working in his favor. Cassandra lowered her phone into her purse and zipped it shut, the exact instant the story stopped going the way she wanted it documented. At the head table, Brent sat bolt upright for 1 second, like he'd been startled out of a doze, then sank back and stared into his glass for the rest of the night, the failed heir who couldn't even meet the eyes of a room that had just figured out who actually deserved the seat of honor. Murray, 91 years old, 2 tours behind him, planted both hands flat on the table and pushed himself up slowly, deliberately, the way a man stands when he intends for it to count. He raised his right hand to his brow and held the salute, textbook, not a word out of him. A second veteran stood, then a third. Then it moved through that hall the way bad news moves through a barracks, silent, total, unstoppable. Every former service member in the room rose, no applause, no sound except chairs scraping wood. The most expensive kind of silence there is, the kind that says we see you, and no mother, no uncle, no small town has the authority to erase what you've actually done. My mother's eyes trembled. Her lower lip twitched once before she clamped it down with whatever composure she had left. I stepped forward. Each footstep on that hardwood cracked through the silence. I stopped 2 feet in front of her and looked into the same eyes that had watched a 9-year-old scrub tile with a toothbrush, the same eyes that had watched a 17-year-old's future fall to the floor in pieces, and I spoke loud enough to reach every wall in that room. Respect isn't something you assign, I told her. It's earned with years of work nobody in this room, including you, ever bothered to see. Don't ever use my uniform as your punchline again. I held her gaze for 3 seconds, then turned and walked back through the standing veterans and sat down. Behind me, not a single person took the seat beside her. I drove out to the house that night, not for her, for the last thing of my father's still inside it. His journal, kept in the nightstand drawer beside the bed where he'd spent his final months coughing quietly into a pillow so she wouldn't hear and complain. She was standing in the kitchen when I came through the back door, not waiting for me, just with nowhere else left to go. The hands that had once torn my application into confetti were gripping the edge of the sink, knuckles pale. I pulled out a chair and sat at the table, the same table I'd scratched as a kid, the same table that had cost me 4 hours against a wall. I didn't say anything. In my line of work, there's a method called pressure through silence, more effective than any direct question, because it forces the other person to fill the space with whatever they've been carrying. She broke first, turning around, her voice thin in a way I'd never heard from her in 30 years. I always pictured a son carrying this family forward, she said. What I did was stupid. That wasn't an apology. People like my mother don't apologize. They downgrade the offense to an arithmetic error so they don't have to own it as a moral one. Stupid wasn't a confession. It was a reclassification. I looked at her for a long moment, the way you look at something one last time before you put it away for good. I didn't need to be a son to carry this family's name anywhere, I told her. I carved my own name into something real with my own hands. You couldn't break me, and you'll never get another chance to try. She sank into the chair across from me, and whatever armor she had left fell away, leaving something smaller than I'd expected. A woman in a tailored blazer that didn't mean anything anymore, sitting in a kitchen she'd ruled for 30 years, across from the one person she'd spent that whole time trying to diminish. One word came out of her, dry and unfamiliar in her mouth, like language she'd memorized but never had reason to use. Proud, she said, like she was handling a piece of broken glass she'd just found on the floor. But it landed on the table between us and just sat there, no weight to it, because that's the thing about words that show up 20 years too late. They don't fill the hole, they just remind you it was always there. I'd spent the first decade of my life starving for exactly that word, scrubbing floors for it, standing against walls for it, watching my father die trying to win it for me. It had expired a long time before that night, not because I hated her, not because I wanted to hurt her back, but because I'd already built an entire career and an entire life on people trusting me with their lives without it. The need for her approval had been the last chain, and somewhere between that kitchen and a posting overseas, it had rusted through and finally come off. I stood up, picked up my cap off the table, and walked out without slamming the door, without a parting line, the way you leave a room once everything on the agenda's been settled and there's nothing left to discuss. Before my flight back out the next morning, I drove to the cemetery outside Aurelia, not out of obligation, because there was one person who'd earned the right to hear the final report. The grounds were empty at that hour, just me and the maples and the wet grass under my boots. I found his marker under the biggest oak in the lot, exactly where he'd asked to be put, because he'd said a man like him should have something solid standing over him. I knelt and read the line I'd had the stonemason carve under his name: a good father. A better friend. Nothing else was necessary. I pulled off my glove and pressed my bare hand flat against the cold marble, colder than anything I'd touched on 3 different postings. "I made it, Dad," I said quietly. "I became exactly what you told me I could be, and she can't take any of it from me now." I reached into my jacket and pulled out the dog tags, his father's, then 20 years carried in the lining of my boots and the lining of my kit, against my chest through every sleepless night waiting for a radio to crackle back to life. I held them one last time, then set them against the base of the headstone, leaned against the marble like the last card laid face up on a table. "I don't need to carry these anymore," I told him. "You gave me the first thing I ever owned that mattered, and it wasn't the medal. It was believing I was worth something. That was always enough." I stood, squared my shoulders, and held a salute for 5 long seconds, not because anyone was watching or any regulation required it, but because it was the only gesture I had left that could carry the whole weight of what I felt without it breaking apart in my hands. Sometimes peace doesn't show up wearing an apology. Sometimes it just arrives the day you finally stop waiting for one.